She didn't ask for a raise. She didn't ask for a favor. She just asked for leftover food. The CEO barely noticed her before that moment. To him, she was just another employee, someone working behind the scenes, someone who never spoke up. But the way she asked, it stopped him cold. She wasn't begging. She wasn't demanding. But there was something in her voice, a quiet kind of desperation. Why would someone with a steady job need food scraps? That question wouldn't leave his mind. So, he followed her home. And what he saw changed everything. Stay till the end, because this story goes from shocking to life-changing. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Her name was Lisa. For 6 years, she had worked in the company's cafeteria. She wasn't someone people noticed. She showed up on time, did her job, and never complained. She was quiet, polite, and never asked for anything. Until today, lunch rush was over, and the kitchen staff was cleaning up. Trays of untouched food were being tossed out. It happened every day, but today, Lisa hesitated. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost drowned out by the clatter of dishes, she asked, "Can I take some of the leftovers home?" Her words were simple, but something about the way she said them felt different. She wasn't joking. She wasn't asking casually. She was nervous, like she didn't want anyone to hear. Like she was ashamed to even say the words out loud. And that was the moment Daniel Carter, the CEO, overheard her. He had only stopped by the cafeteria to grab a quick coffee before heading to his next meeting. Normally, he wouldn't have noticed a conversation like this. But something about Lisa's request made him pause. He glanced at her. She looked the same as always. Hair neatly tied back, uniform clean, posture straight. But now that he was paying attention, he noticed things he hadn't before. Her uniform was slightly faded. Her shoes were worn. Her shoulders were a little too tense. Lisa had been working here for 6 years. She had a steady job. So why was she asking for leftover food? Daniel watched as the manager nodded at Lisa and gestured toward the food being thrown away. "Sure," he said, like it was nothing. Like it wasn't strange that an employee was asking for scraps instead of eating lunch like everyone else. Lisa gave a quiet, grateful nod and quickly packed some of the untouched food into a container before slipping it into her bag. Daniel couldn't stop thinking about it. A full-time employee at his company shouldn't have to ask for leftovers. She had a job. She had a paycheck. So why did she look like someone barely holding things together? The thought wouldn't leave him. So instead of heading back to his office, he made a decision. He was going to find out exactly what was going on. Daniel couldn't ignore it. Lisa had worked at his company for 6 years. She was a full-time employee, not someone who should have been asking for leftover food like it was her only option. He had built his company on the belief that hard work paid off, that his employees were treated well, yet here was one of them, hesitating before asking for something that should have been a basic right. He needed to understand why. He watched as she quietly packed some untouched food into a container, tucked it into her bag, and walked out. She didn't chat with anyone, didn't stop for small talk. She just left, head down, moving quickly. Daniel expected her to go to the parking lot, maybe get into a car or wait for a ride, but she didn't. She walked past the lot, past the bus stop, and kept going. He hesitated for a moment, then followed her at a distance. At first, he assumed she lived nearby. Maybe she enjoyed walking. But as the minutes passed, he realized she wasn't walking for convenience. She was walking because she had no other option. His employees earned enough to afford a decent living, At least that's what he thought. But Lisa, she walked through busy streets, past stores and restaurants, her pace steady, her posture tense. She never slowed down, never looked around. After 40 minutes, she finally reached her destination. Daniel expected her to turn into an apartment complex, a small house, maybe a shared living space. But when she stopped, his heart dropped. She was standing in front of a homeless shelter. Lisa, his employee, someone who showed up to work every day, who did her job without complaints, who smiled at customers, was homeless. He watched as she greeted a volunteer, walked inside, and disappeared. This wasn't a temporary stop, this was her home. Daniel felt a wave of guilt crash over him. How had he missed this? How had someone in his company ended up in a situation like this? He had always believed he took care of his employees, that they were paid fairly, that their work provided them with stability. But Lisa's reality told a different story. He turned around and walked back to his car, his mind racing. Had he been so focused on company growth, profits, and expansion that he had forgotten about the people working under him? If Lisa was struggling like this, how many others were in the same position? That night, he didn't go home. He went back to his office and started digging. He pulled up payroll records, employee files, and salary reports. What he found left him stunned. Lisa wasn't alone. There were others. Employees who were barely scraping by, living paycheck to paycheck, skipping meals just to afford rent. Some were single parents struggling to keep food on the table. Others were working extra shifts, not for luxuries, but just to survive. Daniel had spent years sitting in meetings discussing company success, profitability, and market expansion. But what good was success if the very people making it possible were suffering? He thought about Lisa walking for miles after a long shift. Thought about the hesitation in her voice when she asked for leftovers. She hadn't complained. She hadn't asked for a raise or special treatment. She had simply asked for food that was going to be thrown away. That realization hit him harder than anything. Lisa wasn't just another employee. She was proof that the system was broken. He kept scrolling through reports, finding more of the same. Employees with years of service earning just enough to survive, but never enough to get ahead. No emergency savings, no financial security. People who worked hard, yet still lived on the edge of poverty. He checked past complaints, feedback forms, and HR reports. Everything was there, buried under bureaucratic processes and corporate indifference. Employees had raised concerns, but nothing had changed. Raises were small, benefits were cut whenever budgets got tight, and promotions were given based on numbers, not on need. Daniel leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a failure. And it wasn't just Lisa's problem, it was his. All his life, he had believed in working hard, earning success, and rewarding effort. But if that were really true, then why were his own employees, the people who kept his company running, struggling like this? He could have gone to bed that night, told himself he'd deal with it in the morning. But he didn't, because now that he had seen the truth, there was no looking away. Lisa had spent 6 years at his company, and not once had she complained. Not once had she asked for anything beyond what she had earned. She had simply done her job and accepted whatever came with it, and that was the problem. How many others had done the same? How many had suffered in silence, believing that nothing would change even if they spoke up? Daniel wasn't just looking at numbers anymore. He was looking at people, real people with lives outside of work, with families, with struggles that should have never reached this point. And now he had a choice. Ignore what he had seen and continue running his company the way he always had, or change everything. That night, Daniel made a decision. Everything was about to be different. Daniel couldn't sleep. The numbers, the reports, the reality of what he had just learned kept playing in his mind. Lisa wasn't just one struggling employee. She was one of many. People who worked full-time yet barely had enough to survive. People who showed up every day, smiled, did their jobs, and went home to a life of struggle. And that was if they even had a home. Lisa didn't. The next morning, he made a decision. He needed to talk to her. Not as a CEO, not as a boss, but as someone who had just woken up to a truth he couldn't ignore. He drove back to the shelter and waited outside. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he knew he needed answers. Lisa stepped out a few minutes later, dressed in the same neatly pressed uniform, her hair pulled back just like every other day. She looked up, saw him, and froze. "Lisa," he said, stepping forward. Her body stiffened. She wasn't expecting this. She wasn't prepared for a conversation with the CEO of the company she worked for. "Mr. Carter?" Her voice was cautious. Daniel took a breath. "I need to understand," he said. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" She glanced around, visibly uncomfortable. "Tell them what?" "That you're living in a shelter," he said. "That you're struggling." Her face went blank. Then she looked away. "I don't need pity," she said quietly. "This isn't about pity," Daniel said. "It's about what's right. You've worked for my company for 6 years. You show up every day, you do your job, and then you walk back here at night. That's not how it should be." Lisa sighed, adjusting the strap on her bag. "I've never asked for anything. I don't want special treatment." "That's the problem," Daniel said. "You shouldn't have to ask. No one should be working full-time and still struggling to eat." Lisa hesitated. Then, for the first time, she spoke honestly. "I was fine before," she said. "I had a place. I had stability. Then my husband got sick. The medical bills piled up. I worked extra shifts, but it was never enough. He passed away 2 years ago, and after that, everything fell apart." Daniel listened, his chest tightening with every word. "I lost my apartment," Lisa continued. "I tried to find another place, but rents went up, and even with a full-time job, I couldn't afford it. Shelters were my only option. So I started living here, saving up, hoping things would get better. But they don't. Not when every paycheck barely covers food and essentials." Daniel exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about one person's bad luck. This was a system that had failed her. A woman who had done everything right, who had worked hard, who had played by the rules, and yet she still lost everything. "How many others?" Daniel asked. "How many people at the company are dealing with this?" Lisa shrugged. "More than you think," she said. "Some live with family. Some work 2 jobs just to afford rent. Most of us just don't talk about it because, what's the point? Nothing changes." Daniel felt a sharp pang of guilt. She was right. Nothing changed because people at the top never saw the struggles of those at the bottom. They never asked. They never listened. Until now. Daniel looked at her, realizing that this moment, this conversation, wasn't just about Lisa anymore. It was about everyone like her. The workers who kept his company running, the people who were treated as numbers on a spreadsheet instead of human beings with real lives and real struggles. For the first time in his career, Daniel felt ashamed. Not because he had done something wrong, but because he had done nothing at all. He had assumed his company was fair, that it paid well, that his employees were living comfortably, but assumptions were dangerous. And in this case, they had blinded him to a reality that had been in front of him all along. Lisa shifted her weight. "I need to get to work," she said, her voice cautious, as if she didn't know how this conversation would end. Daniel nodded. "I won't keep you, but I want you to know something." She raised an eyebrow. "This is the last day you'll ever have to worry about your next meal," he said, "or where you'll sleep." Lisa's eyes widened, but she didn't speak. Daniel continued, his voice steady. "I can't change the past, but I can change what happens next." And with that, he walked away, already knowing that by the end of the day, everything at his company would be different. Daniel left that conversation a different man. The weight of Lisa's words sat heavy on his shoulders. He had spent years believing his company was built on fairness, that hard work led to success. But now, he had proof that wasn't true. A full-time employee, loyal for 6 years, had lost everything despite doing everything right. And she wasn't alone. That night, he sat in his office long after everyone else had left. He wasn't thinking about profits or expansion. He was thinking about the people who worked for him, the ones who showed up every day, did their jobs, and still struggled to survive. He pulled up salary reports, employee expense records, and turnover rates. The numbers told a harsh truth. Some employees were barely making enough to live. Some had been working for years with no significant raise. Some were juggling second jobs just to cover rent. The realization hit hard. His company was failing the people who made it run. That wasn't leadership. That was neglect. He thought about Lisa's hesitation before asking for leftover food. She had been too proud to ask for help. How many others were suffering in silence? How many were living paycheck to paycheck, afraid to speak up because they believed no one would care? He picked up his phone and made a decision. Things were about to change. The next morning, he called an emergency executive meeting. His board members filed in, some looking confused, others concerned. This wasn't scheduled. This wasn't part of their usual agenda. Daniel wasted no time. "We have a problem," he said, placing a folder on the table, "and it's bigger than any of us realized." The room went silent. He opened the folder and pulled out a report, filled with pages of employee financial data. "Our workers are struggling," he continued. "Some are barely affording rent. Some can't even buy food. I found out yesterday that one of our full-time employees, Lisa from the cafeteria, has been homeless for 2 years." Murmurs filled the room. A few exchanged nervous glances. Daniel didn't stop. "This company brings in millions," he said. "We talk about growth, profits, expansion. But what about our people? What kind of success is this if the people running the business can't even afford basic necessities?" A board member cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Daniel, salaries are competitive for this industry." Daniel cut him off. "Are they?" He gestured to the reports. "Because these numbers say otherwise. We've given raises, sure, but have they kept up with the cost of living? Have they actually improved lives?" Silence. He continued, his voice sharp. "If someone is working full-time and still can't afford housing, the system is broken. And if we're part of that system, then we need to fix it." One of the executives frowned. "This is a business. We can't just hand out raises because of one isolated case." Daniel's jaw tightened. This isn't about one person. This is about the entire workforce. He took a breath, then spoke with finality. "We're restructuring wages. Immediately." A few gasps. Someone shifted uncomfortably in their seat. That's going to cost millions, another board member argued. And, Daniel shot back, we make millions. If we can afford executive bonuses, luxury offices, and first-class travel, we can afford to pay our employees what they deserve. A long silence stretched across the room. Daniel leaned forward. We have two choices. We can do the bare minimum and pretend we don't see the problem. Or we can lead. We can be the company that actually values its workers, not just in words but in action. The board members exchanged looks. Some hesitated, but others nodded. Daniel didn't wait for a vote. Starting today, every employee will receive a raise that actually makes a difference. No one working full-time should be struggling to survive. He wasn't finished. We're also implementing emergency financial assistance. If an employee is in crisis, the company will step in. No more workers losing their homes because they can't afford an unexpected expense. A few board members looked like they wanted to argue, but none did. And one more thing, Daniel added. Our company policy on food. It changes today. No more throwing away perfectly good meals when we have employees who need them. If someone wants to take home extra food, they take it. No shame, no questions. More silence. Then, slowly, a few board members nodded. The resistance started to fade. Daniel looked at them, his voice calm but firm. This isn't a PR stunt. This isn't a one-time fix. This is about changing the way we do business. If we don't take care of our people, we don't deserve success. After a long pause, someone finally spoke. Let's do it. The rest followed. Daniel exhaled. This was just the beginning. But it was the right beginning. The decision was made, but Daniel knew actions spoke louder than words. Announcing raises and emergency funds wasn't enough. Real change had to happen immediately. By the next morning, every department received an email, new policies, new wages, and an internal fund designed to help employees in crisis. Some were skeptical. Others didn't believe it would last. Employees had heard promises before, but this time it was different. Lisa walked into work, unaware of what had been set in motion. She expected another routine day, but something felt off. People were whispering, glancing at their phones, scrolling through emails. Then her manager approached her. "You should check your inbox," he said. Lisa hesitated, then opened her phone. The first email stopped her cold. Effective immediately. Salary adjustments. She read every word, her hands shaking. Every employee under a certain threshold had received a significant raise. Not a small, incremental bump. A life-changing difference. Lisa wasn't the only one in shock. Across departments, workers stared at their screens, some tearing up, others rereading the numbers as if expecting them to change. For the first time in years, they felt seen. That wasn't all. The next email announced an emergency relief fund. If an employee faced a crisis, medical bills, housing instability, family emergencies, the company would step in. No more losing everything over one unexpected expense. And then came the biggest surprise. Lisa's manager placed a folder in front of her. "Daniel Carter wants to see you," he said. Her stomach dropped. Had she done something wrong? Was she about to lose her job? When she walked into the CEO's office, she expected formality, a rehearsed corporate speech. Instead, Daniel looked at her with something she hadn't seen before. Genuine concern. "You don't have to live in a shelter anymore," he said. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. She tried to speak, but no words came out. "We set up housing assistance," Daniel continued. "We found a place for you. Safe, comfortable, close to work." Lisa shook her head. I can't afford." "It's covered," Daniel interrupted. "Not as charity, not as a handout, as recognition for the work you do." Tears welled in Lisa's eyes. For years she had struggled. She had fought to survive, to stay strong for her kids, to hold on to any shred of dignity she had left. And now someone had finally paid attention. Daniel didn't stop there. The company didn't just raise wages and offer assistance. It completely restructured how it operated. Unused food was no longer wasted. Instead, it was packaged and sent home with employees who needed it. No shame, no questions, no stigma. Financial literacy programs were introduced, helping workers understand budgeting, savings, and long-term financial security. Healthcare benefits were expanded, covering mental health support, child care assistance, and emergency leave. And, most importantly, a new culture was born. For the first time, employees weren't just showing up for a paycheck. They were showing up because they felt valued. Months passed, and the changes didn't fade. If anything, they grew stronger. Productivity increased. Morale skyrocketed. Employee retention improved. Investors were skeptical at first, worried about profit loss, but the results were undeniable. A happy workforce led to better business, better service, and higher overall success. Other companies took notice. Articles were written. Headlines called it the company that chose people over profits and still won. Daniel watched it all unfold, knowing one thing for certain. This wasn't about good PR or saving face. It was about doing what should have been done all along. Daniel never expected a simple request for leftover food to expose a massive flaw in his company. He had spent years thinking he was running a business that valued its employees, but the truth was right in front of him. Hard-working people were struggling, and no one had noticed. Lisa's story was a wake-up call. She had done everything right. She worked full-time, showed up every day, and never asked for special treatment. Yet, she had lost everything. If someone like her could end up homeless while employed, how many others were silently fighting the same battle? The more Daniel thought about it, the more he realized the problem wasn't just inside his company. It was everywhere. Across industries, workers were being paid just enough to survive, not to thrive. People were one emergency away from losing their homes, one missed paycheck from complete financial ruin. But no one talked about it. They suffered in silence because they believed nothing would change. They accepted it as the way things were. That was the real issue. Not just low wages, not just broken systems. The silence. Lisa had never spoken up, not because she didn't want help, but because she thought no one would care. And for years she was right. Until one person noticed. Until one conversation changed everything. Daniel couldn't stop thinking about that. How many other CEOs were blind to what was happening right under their noses? How many leaders sat in comfortable offices, reviewing spreadsheets, completely disconnected from the real lives of their employees? The problem wasn't ignorance. It was willful blindness. Companies focused on numbers, profits, growth. But what about the workers making that success possible? What about the people cleaning offices, cooking meals, running customer service, stocking shelves? These weren't just job titles. They were real people, with real struggles, working harder than ever yet, barely making it through the month. And for what? So the executives at the top could take home bonuses while the workers at the bottom skipped meals. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. And the worst part? It had been happening for years, and no one questioned it. Lisa's story wasn't just about one person. It was about an entire workforce being overlooked, underpaid, and ignored. It was about a system that needed to be broken, and it started with paying attention. Because if Daniel hadn't overheard that one request, if he had walked past like everyone else, nothing would have changed. Lisa would still be homeless. Employees would still be struggling. The company would still be treating people as numbers instead of human beings. But one moment, one decision to listen, set off a chain reaction that changed everything. And that's the lesson. Pay attention. Because right now, there are people around you who are suffering, who are barely holding on, who are afraid to speak up because they believe no one will care. And maybe no one has yet. But what if you noticed? What if you asked? What if, instead of walking past, you did something? Change doesn't start with policies or corporate meetings. It starts with one person deciding not to look away. That's how the world gets better. And if more people paid attention, if more leaders actually cared, if more companies valued people over profits, then maybe, just maybe, stories like Lisa's wouldn't happen in the first place. Because no one working full-time should be homeless. No one should have to beg for leftovers. And no one should be invisible. Lisa wasn't invisible anymore. And now, neither was the problem. Lisa's story wasn't just about her. It was about a broken system. A system that expected people to work hard, but didn't guarantee them a stable life. A system where full-time employees still struggled to survive while companies made record profits. But this time, something changed. One simple request for leftover food led to a wake-up call. Wages increased. Emergency funds were created. Employees no longer had to suffer in silence. A company transformed overnight, all because one person noticed. Now here's the real question. How many Lisas are out there? How many people around us are silently struggling, at work, in our communities, even in our own families? And how many times have we walked past them without realizing it? Because real change doesn't start with corporations or governments. It starts with you. Daniel could have ignored what he saw. He could have gone back to his office, focused on profits, and pretended everything was fine. But instead, he paid attention. And because of that, hundreds of lives changed. Now, ask yourself, what if you were the one who noticed? What if the next time you saw someone struggling, you stopped, asked, listened, acted? Would you do it? Tell us in the comments. Have you ever seen someone in need but didn't know how to help? Let's talk about it. If you believe no one should struggle alone, hit the like button. Comment, I'm paying attention if this story changed the way you see the world. Share this video, because the more people who see this, the more lives can change. Subscribe for more stories that reveal the truth about the world around us. Because change starts with one person, one decision, one action. Maybe that person is you.